The night is quiet around you now, the kind of silence that invites reflection, that opens spaces for thoughts that move slowly, like ancient rivers carving their patient paths through stone. Tonight, we invite you to journey with us through time and across a vast continent, not with urgency or alarm, but with the gentle, steady rhythm of remembrance. We are going to walk through the halls of libraries that no longer exist, to stand in the presence of books that have turned to ash, to listen for the whispers of knowledge that was deliberately, systematically erased from human memory. This is not a story of anger, though anger would be justified. This is not a tale of despair, though the losses are immeasurable. This is, instead, a meditation, a quiet act of bearing witness, a gentle acknowledgement that before the fires, before the destruction, there was light, there was wisdom, there was an intellectual tradition so rich, so profound, that its echoes still resonate in the silence, if only we learn to listen. Close your eyes if you wish. Let your breathing slow to match the pace of these words. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to solve or fix, only this invitation to remember, to honor, to understand that the story of human knowledge is not complete without the chapters that were burned, the voices that were silenced, the libraries that were reduced to smoke and ash and deliberate forgetting. But even ash holds memory, even silence speaks, and tonight, in this quiet hour, we will listen to what remains. Our journey begins not with destruction, but with creation, with understanding. Before we can truly comprehend what was lost, we must first know what existed. We must see in our mind's eye the great libraries of Africa as they once stood, not as ruins or absences, but as living centers of learning, as repositories of human wisdom that rivaled and often surpassed anything that existed elsewhere in the world during their time. For Africa's intellectual tradition is not a story of absence, it is a story of presence that was deliberately obscured, of achievement that was systematically erased, of light that was extinguished but never entirely destroyed. Let us begin in the ancient world, in the city that was once the intellectual capital of the entire Mediterranean, the city of Alexandria, Alexandria in Egypt. We know it now primarily through its loss, through the legendary burning of its library. But before the flames, before the centuries of destruction, Alexandria was a marvel. Built by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, it became, under the Ptolemaic dynasty, a magnet for scholars from across the known world. The Library of Alexandria, or more accurately, the libraries, for there were several buildings, was not merely a storehouse of scrolls. It was a living university, a research institution, a place where scholars were paid to study, to think, to debate, to discover. At its height, it is believed to have contained somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Every ship that entered the harbor of Alexandria was required to surrender its books for copying. The originals were often kept, and the copies returned to the owners. This was how hungry the library was for knowledge, how determined to preserve every fragment of human wisdom it could gather. What was in those scrolls? We can only partially know, for so much was lost. But we know there were mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, medical texts, poetry, drama, philosophy, the complete works of authors whose names we now know only as fragments or not at all. Euclid wrote his Elements in Alexandria.
the foundation of geometry for 2,000 years. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing but shadows and reasoning. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 17 centuries before Copernicus. Hero of Alexandria invented the first steam engine, a curiosity, a toy in his time, but a principle that would eventually change the world. All of this happened in Africa, in an African city, in a library that stood on African soil. The destruction came not once, but many times, like a tide returning again and again, wearing away ashore. Julius Caesar's legions set fires in 48 BCE during their conflict with Ptolemy XIII, and the flames spread to part of the library. Later attacks came from religious zealots, Christian mobs who saw pagan learning as dangerous, as heretical. In 391 CE, the Serapeum, a daughter library, was destroyed by decree of the Roman Emperor Theodosius, its scrolls fed to the flames in the name of religious purity. And later still, perhaps, though the historical record is murky, Islamic conquerors in the 7th century may have contributed to further losses, though this narrative is contested and may itself be a later invention designed to assign blame. What matters is not precisely who held the torch. What matters is that the light was extinguished. Slowly, over centuries, the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, much of it preserved nowhere else, was deliberately destroyed, not by accident, not by natural decay, but by those who feared knowledge, who feared plurality of thought, who believed that certain ideas were dangerous and must be eliminated from human memory. And with the burning of Alexandria, countless voices fell silent. Entire fields of knowledge vanished. Questions that had been asked were forgotten and would not be asked again for 1,000 years. Let the weight of this settle gently as you breathe. Do not hold tension in your body. Simply allow the sadness of it to exist, like rain falling on distant water. The knowledge is gone, but the fact that it existed, the fact that human minds in Africa achieved such heights of understanding, this cannot be erased. The destruction tells us as much as the creation. It tells us that knowledge is powerful, that those who wish to control humanity have always understood that the first thing they must control is what people are allowed to know, allowed to remember, allowed to learn. We move now through time and space, across the vast expanse of the Sahara Desert to the southern edge of that great sea of sand where cities rose like miracles from the dust. This is the Sahel, the region that stretches across Africa just south of the desert, and in the medieval period it was home to some of the richest, most powerful, and most intellectually vibrant civilizations in the world. We are going to Timbuktu. The name itself has become, in Western imagination, a byword for remoteness, for the ends of the earth, for a place so distant and insignificant that it might as well be mythical. But this too is erasure, a forgetting, for Timbuktu was once a jewel of the Islamic world, a city of scholars and books, of wealth and learning, where manuscripts were valued more than gold.
Timbuktu sits in what is now Mali, on the southern edge of the Sahara. It rose to prominence in the 13th and 14th centuries as a trading post, a place where the gold and salt of Africa met the goods and ideas of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. But it became much more than a market. Under the Mali Empire, and later the Songhai Empire, Timbuktu transformed into an intellectual capital. The University of Sankore, founded in the 14th century, became one of the most important centers of Islamic learning in the entire world. At its height, it had an enrollment of 25,000 students coming from across Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe.
They studied law, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and theology. They debated, they wrote, they copied manuscripts by hand, creating a vast library of human knowledge written in Arabic and in local African languages using Arabic script. The private libraries of Timbuktu were legendary. Wealthy families accumulated collections of thousands of manuscripts, passing them down through generations, adding to them, protecting them as their most precious inheritance. These were not merely religious texts, though there were many of those. These were scientific treatises on astronomy, documenting the movements of the stars from African skies, medical texts describing herbal remedies and surgical techniques, mathematical works exploring algebra and geometry, historical chronicles recording the deeds of kings and the rise and fall of empires, legal texts debating the intricacies of Islamic jurisprudence, philosophical works grappling with the nature of existence, of knowledge, of the divine, and poetry, so much poetry, verses that captured the human heart in all its complexity, its joy and its sorrow. Leo Africanus, a Berber diplomat and scholar who visited Timbuktu in the early 16th century, wrote with wonder about the city. He reported that books and manuscripts were the most valuable commodities in the markets, more prized than any other merchandise. He wrote that here are great stores of doctors, judges, priests, and other learned men that are bountifully maintained at the king's cost and charges. And hither are brought diverse manuscripts or written books out of Barbary, which are sold for more money than any other merchandise. Imagine that for a moment. A city where books are worth more than gold, where scholars are supported by royal patronage, where learning is the highest aspiration. This was Timbuktu. This was Africa in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, while Europe was still emerging from its medieval period, while the Renaissance was just beginning in Italy. Timbuktu was already a shining center of scholarship, preserving and expanding human knowledge. But empires fall. In 1591, the Songhai Empire was defeated by Moroccan forces armed with firearms, a technology that gave them overwhelming advantage. Timbuktu was sacked. Many of its scholars were killed or taken into slavery. The great libraries were scattered. Some manuscripts were destroyed in the chaos of conquest. Others were stolen, taken to Morocco or elsewhere, lost to the families and the city that had created and preserved them. The University of Sankore never recovered its former glory. The patronage system that had supported scholars collapsed, and gradually, over the following centuries, as Mali itself fell under colonial rule, first informal and then formal, the intellectual tradition of Timbuktu faded from international consciousness. It became, in Western imagination, not a real place with a real history, but a metaphor, a joke, the end of nowhere.
But the manuscripts survived. Not all of them, not even most of them, but hundreds of thousands remained, hidden in private family libraries, in chests and trunks, in secret rooms, protected generation after generation by families who understood that these were treasures beyond price. They survived the Moroccan conquest. They survived centuries of political instability. They survived the French colonial period, when African intellectual achievement was systematically denied and degraded. They survived independence and the difficulties that followed, and they were beginning, in recent decades, to be rediscovered by the wider world, to be cataloged, digitized, studied, to reclaim their place in the story of human knowledge. And then came the fires. In 2012 and 2013, during the conflict in northern Mali,
When extremist groups briefly took control of Timbuktu, they set about systematically destroying the city's cultural heritage. They attacked the ancient mosques, structures that had stood for centuries, and they burned manuscripts. In the Ahmed Baba Institute, a modern library that housed some 30,000 manuscripts, fires were set. Thousands of irreplaceable documents were reduced to ash. The extremists declared that these texts, even though they were Islamic texts, were heretical, were idolatrous, were dangerous. They feared the diversity of thought they represented. They feared the evidence they provided of Africa's intellectual heritage. And so they burned them, just as countless others had burned books throughout history when they feared the power of knowledge. But here is where something beautiful happened. The people of Timbuktu, the families who had been guardians of these manuscripts for generations, they acted. In secret, at great personal risk, they organized a rescue operation. They packed manuscripts into trunks and metal chests. They loaded them onto donkeys, into cars, into whatever vehicles they could find, and they smuggled them out of the city, moving them south to Bamako, the capital, where they could be hidden safely until the danger passed. It is estimated that over 370,000 manuscripts were saved through this effort. Librarians became heroes. Ordinary people became the protectors of human heritage. They understood what so many throughout history have understood, that to burn a book is to attempt to burn human memory itself, and they refused to allow it. The manuscripts of Timbuktu still exist. Many are damaged by time, by humidity, by insects, by the rough conditions of their rescue, but they exist, and they are slowly being restored, cataloged, digitized, studied. They are reclaiming their voice. They are speaking again, telling the world a story it had forgotten or never knew, that Africa has always been a center of learning, of intellectual achievement, of profound contributions to human knowledge. The erasure was never complete. The fire was never final. Let yourself rest in this knowledge. Let the tension in your shoulders release. The breathing can slow. In the darkness behind your closed eyes, you can almost see them, can't you? The scholars of Timbuktu bent over their manuscripts by candlelight, copying, thinking, preserving, and centuries later their descendants packing those same manuscripts into trunks, risking everything to save them. An unbroken chain of guardianship, of love for knowledge, stretching across the centuries. This is the human spirit at its best. This is resistance to erasure. This is hope made tangible.
We journey now to another part of the continent, to the east, to the highlands of Ethiopia, where one of the world's oldest Christian civilizations has preserved its own unique intellectual tradition for nearly 2,000 years. Ethiopia is a land of ancient churches carved from solid rock, of monasteries perched on inaccessible mountain peaks, of a written language, Ge'ez, that has remained in continuous use for religious purposes since the 4th century CE. And it is a land of books, of manuscripts illuminated with extraordinary beauty, of libraries that have stood, in some cases, for over 1,000 years. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained a tradition of literacy and learning even through periods when much of Christian Europe had largely lost those skills. Monks copied the Bible, the lives of saints, theological treatises, historical chronicles, and secular poetry. They illustrated these manuscripts with images of stunning beauty, using colors made from local minerals and plants, creating works of art that were also works of devotion, works of scholarship, works of cultural memory. Each monastery had its library,
its collection of manuscripts, some of them so old they were written on parchment made from the skins of animals that had been dead for 1,000 years. These manuscripts were not museum pieces to the Ethiopians. They were living documents, used in liturgy, consulted for learning, treasured as connections to the past and as guides for the present. They were Ethiopia's memory, written down and preserved. And they were fragile, vulnerable to fire, to water, to insects, to war, to the simple decay of time. In the 16th century, during the devastating war with the Sultanate of Adal, led by Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Khazi, known as Grang, much of Ethiopia's cultural heritage was destroyed. Churches were burned, monasteries were sacked, countless manuscripts, some of them unique copies of works that existed nowhere else, were lost. The Portuguese, who came as allies to help Ethiopia defend itself, also took manuscripts back to Europe, where many vanished into private collections or were destroyed by Europeans who did not value or understand them. In the 19th century, a more calculated act of cultural theft occurred. In 1868, British forces under Lord Napier invaded Ethiopia in a punitive expedition against Emperor Theodrosos II. After the emperor's defeat and death, the British looted the royal library at Magdala. They took an estimated 1,000 manuscripts, along with countless other cultural treasures, and shipped them back to Britain. These manuscripts ended up in the British Library, in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, in the Royal Library at Windsor Castle, in museums and private collections. Ethiopia has been requesting their return for over 150 years. Some have been returned, most have not. They remain in Britain, severed from the culture that created them, from the people who have the greatest claim to them, from the living tradition of which they were a part.
This is a different kind of burning, a different kind of erasure. Not destruction by fire, but destruction by separation. The manuscripts still exist, but they have been removed from their context, from their meaning. They have been turned from living documents into museum curiosities, from cultural memory into exotic artifacts. The loss is not total, but it is real, and it is ongoing, because every day they remain in foreign institutions is another day that Ethiopian scholars, Ethiopian students, Ethiopian people cannot access their own heritage without traveling thousands of miles and asking permission from institutions that took these works by force. In more recent times, Ethiopia has faced other threats to its manuscript heritage: political instability, civil wars, lack of resources for preservation, the simple challenge of protecting ancient, fragile documents in a developing country with many urgent needs. But there have also been efforts at preservation. The Ethiopian Heritage Fund and other organizations work to digitize manuscripts, to train conservators, to protect these irreplaceable documents for future generations. The work continues, patient and determined, against formidable odds. Breathe slowly now. Let the story settle. Feel the weight of it, but do not let it create tension in your body. This is history. This happened. But it is not happening to you, here, now, in this safe, quiet moment. You are simply bearing witness, simply remembering, simply honoring those who created beauty and knowledge, and those who fought to preserve it. We must speak now of a loss that is harder to document because it was so complete: the systematic destruction of indigenous African knowledge systems by colonialism. This was not the burning of a single library that can be pointed to, dated, mourned.
This was a slow, deliberate erasure that took place over centuries, across an entire continent, in thousands of villages and kingdoms, and it was often not done with fire, but with education, with religion, with law, with the imposition of a worldview that declared African knowledge to be not merely inferior, but non-existent. When European colonizers arrived in Africa, they brought with them the certainty that they were superior, that their knowledge was real knowledge, their science real science, their history real history, their religion real religion, and that anything that Africans knew, anything that Africans had developed over thousands of years of living on and understanding their own continent, was at best primitive superstition and at worst dangerous savagery that must be eradicated for the African's own good.
And so began a systematic assault on African epistemology, African ways of knowing. Indigenous religions, which contained vast stores of ethical teaching, cosmological understanding, and social wisdom, were banned. Their practitioners were persecuted as witches or devil worshippers. The sacred groves where knowledge was transmitted were cut down. The shrines were destroyed. The initiation ceremonies where young people learned the accumulated wisdom of their culture were forbidden. The languages in which this knowledge was encoded were suppressed in favor of European languages. Children were taken from their families and placed in mission schools where they were beaten for speaking their mother tongues, where they were taught that everything their ancestors had known was worthless, where they were trained to be ashamed of their own cultures. This was epistemic violence, the deliberate destruction of a people's way of knowing and understanding the world. And the loss is incalculable, because so much of African knowledge was oral. It was not written in books that could be burned or stolen. It was held in human memory, transmitted through story, through song, through ritual, through apprenticeship. And when the chain of transmission was broken, when the elders were not allowed to teach the young, when the languages themselves began to die, the knowledge died with them, irretrievably, finally. What was lost? We can only partially know because it is lost. But we know that African societies had sophisticated agricultural knowledge, understanding which crops to plant when, how to manage soil fertility, how to predict weather patterns, knowledge developed over thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation. We know they had medical knowledge, herbal remedies that have been proven by modern science to be effective, surgical techniques that were in some cases more advanced than those used in Europe at the same time. We know they had astronomical knowledge, using the stars for navigation, for determining agricultural calendars, encoding cosmic observations in myth and architecture. We know they had mathematical knowledge, complex systems of counting and calculation, geometric principles used in art and architecture. We know they had philosophical knowledge, ethical systems, metaphysical understandings, conceptions of the nature of reality and the human place within it.
All of this existed, and much of it was deliberately destroyed, not because it was false, but because it was African, because it threatened the colonial narrative that Africans were primitive, childlike, incapable of civilization, and therefore needed European rule for their own benefit. The destruction of African knowledge was necessary to justify African subjugation. You cannot claim to be bringing enlightenment to people who already have their own enlightenment. So the colonizers had to first extinguish the light, then claim they were bringing it. There is a particular pain in mourning a loss you cannot fully articulate because you do not know the full extent of what was taken. It is like grieving for a person you never met, but who you know was wise, was kind,
was full of stories that will never be told. This is the grief of cultural destruction. This is the violence of erasure. But even here, even in the face of this systematic destruction, preservation happened. Resistance happened. People hid their knowledge. They practiced their religions in secret. They continued to speak their languages at home, even when it was forbidden in public. They adapted, syncretizing their own beliefs with the Christianity or Islam that was forced upon them, creating hybrid forms that preserved the essence of the old ways in new containers. They waited, and when independence came, when it was finally safe to openly reclaim what had been suppressed, they brought forth what had been hidden. Not everything, so much was lost, but something remained. The fire was never quite complete. In West Africa, in what is now Mauritania, there was another great library tradition, the libraries of Shingeti, one of the 7 holy cities of Islam, founded in the 13th century. This city in the desert held one of the most important collections of Islamic manuscripts in the world, with some families possessing libraries of thousands of volumes. These manuscripts covered every field of Islamic learning: Quranic commentary, hadith, jurisprudence, grammar, poetry, history, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Some dated back to the 9th century, making them among the oldest surviving Islamic texts in the world. The manuscripts were preserved in private family libraries, passed down from father to son for generations. The families of Shingeti took their role as guardians seriously, understanding that they were preserving not just books, but civilization itself. The dry desert climate helped preserve the manuscripts, but they still faced threats: the encroaching sand that constantly threatens to bury the city, the humidity during the brief rainy season, insects, and the simple fact that paper and parchment decay over time.
In recent decades, as Mauritania has faced political instability and poverty, many of these manuscripts have been sold to foreign collectors or institutions. They have left the country, dispersed across the world. Some have been digitized and are accessible online, but the physical documents, with their history, their marginalia, the fingerprints of the scholars who studied them centuries ago, these are gone. Others remain, still held by families who resist the temptation to sell despite their economic hardships, who continue to see themselves as guardians of a heritage that belongs not just to them, but to humanity. In Djenné, another ancient city in Mali, the same story repeats. Private libraries of manuscripts, some families possessing collections dating back centuries, struggling to preserve them without adequate resources, facing the constant threat of loss through sale, theft, decay, or conflict. In Gao, in Kano, in Katsina, across the Sahel, the pattern is the same. Great manuscript traditions, evidence of Africa's intellectual heritage, surviving against enormous odds, maintained by people who receive little support, little recognition, but who persist because they understand the value of what they protect. The challenge of preservation is not merely financial, though that is significant. It is also political and philosophical. For the existence of these manuscripts, the evidence they provide of Africa's intellectual achievements, contradicts a narrative that has been powerful and profitable for centuries. The narrative that Africa has no history, no civilization, no contribution to human knowledge. This narrative was used to justify slavery, to justify colonialism, to justify the extraction of Africa's resources and the exploitation of its people. And even now, when such attitudes are no longer publicly acceptable, the narrative persists in subtler forms. in the surprise people express when they learn of Africa's intellectual heritage, in the underfunding of African institutions, in the way African knowledge is still often treated as exotic curiosity rather than serious scholarship. To preserve Africa's manuscripts, to study them, to make them known, is a political act. It is an act of reclamation. It is a rejection of erasure. It is an insistence that African history be told by Africans, that African knowledge be valued on its own terms, that the human story be complete, not just the story as told by the victors.
Let us journey now to South Africa, to the Library of the University of Cape Town. In April 2021, a fire swept through the upper slopes of Table Mountain and reached the university campus. The fire destroyed the Jagger Reading Room, a historic library building, and with it, a significant portion of the university's special collections. Among the losses were rare African manuscripts, colonial-era documents, historical photographs, and irreplaceable archives documenting South African history. The fire was accidental, caused by extreme weather and difficult terrain that made it hard to control, but the loss was no less devastating for being unintentional. These were unique materials that existed nowhere else, primary sources for understanding South African history, the voices of people who could no longer speak for themselves. Gone. The University of Cape Town fire reminds us that the threats to African knowledge are not all historical. They continue. Libraries in Africa still face inadequate funding, lack of climate control, vulnerability to fire and flood, political instability, and sometimes deliberate destruction during conflicts. The preservation of knowledge requires constant effort, constant resources, constant vigilance. It is never finished. It is never secure. And yet the work continues. Across the continent, librarians, archivists, scholars, and ordinary people who understand the value of their heritage continue to fight for its preservation. They work with minimal budgets, with aging infrastructure, often without adequate training or equipment. But they work. They catalog. They digitize, they teach, they repair damaged documents with infinite patience, they advocate for funding, they build networks of support, they refuse to allow the erasure to continue. There are success stories. The Endangered Archives program, run by the British Library, has digitized hundreds of thousands of pages of African manuscripts and made them freely available online. The West African Research Center in Senegal supports scholarship on African history and culture. The Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu, despite the destruction it suffered, continues its work of preserving and studying manuscripts. Universities across Africa are developing conservation programs, training the next generation of archivists and librarians. Individual families continue to open their private libraries to scholars, allowing manuscripts that have been held in secret for centuries to be studied and shared. The technology of digitization has been transformative, creating backup copies of fragile documents, making them accessible to scholars anywhere in the world, removing the need to handle the originals and risk further damage. But digitization is not a complete solution. It requires equipment, expertise, and ongoing maintenance of digital archives. Digital files can be lost as easily as physical documents if not properly stored and backed up. And there is something irreplaceable about the physical object itself. The feel of the paper, the smell of the ink, the marginalia written by hands centuries dead. The sense of direct connection to the past that comes from touching the same object that was touched by those who came before. The preservation of African knowledge is not just an African concern,
It is a human concern. The history of humanity is not complete if African voices are excluded. The story of human knowledge is not fully told if African contributions are erased. Every manuscript that is lost, every oral tradition that dies with its last speaker, every archive that burns diminishes all of us. It makes the human story smaller, less complex, less true. And there is a particular cruelty in the fact that the regions that contributed so much to human knowledge are now, in many cases, unable to access that knowledge because it is held in institutions in Europe and North America. The manuscripts taken from Ethiopia, from Mali, from across the continent, sit in climate-controlled vaults in London, Paris, New York, available to Western scholars, but not to African students, who must travel thousands of miles and often cannot afford to do so. The colonial theft of African cultural heritage continues to harm African scholarship, African education, African self-understanding. Repatriation, the return of cultural objects to their places of origin, is slowly beginning to happen, but it is contested, slow, and incomplete. And every day that passes is another day that African people cannot freely access their own heritage. But there is something that cannot be stolen, cannot be burned, cannot be entirely erased, and that is the fact that the knowledge existed, that African civilizations achieved extraordinary things, that African scholars made contributions to human understanding that were vast and profound, that Africa has always been and continues to be a center of human creativity, ingenuity, and wisdom. The evidence may be fragmentary, the libraries may be burned, but the truth remains. It cannot be destroyed. It can only be obscured. And what is obscured can be revealed again.
As you lie here in the darkness, let yourself imagine the scholars of Alexandria bending over their scrolls by lamplight, calculating the movements of the stars. Imagine the scribes of Timbuktu copying manuscripts with meticulous care, their hands cramping but persisting because they understand they are preserving something precious. Imagine the monks of Ethiopia illuminating their gospels with colors made from flowers and stones, each page a prayer, each letter an act of devotion. Imagine the families of Chinguetti passing their libraries down through generations, teaching their children that these books are more valuable than gold. Imagine the modern librarians working in buildings that may not have air conditioning, with collections that are crumbling, but showing up every day to do the patient work of preservation. These are not separate people, separate stories. They are one story, the human story, the story of our species' relentless drive to understand, to know, to remember, to pass on what we have learned to those who come after us. This impulse has never been limited to one continent, one culture, one civilization. It is universal. It is human. And Africa's part in this story is not a footnote. It is a major chapter, essential and irreplaceable. The fires burned. The knowledge was lost. This is true, but it is not the whole truth. For the fires never burned everything. The colonizers never erased everything. The destruction was never complete. What remains, fragmentary and damaged as it may be, is still a testament, still a voice, still evidence of the indomitable human spirit that creates beauty and knowledge, even in the face of destruction, that preserves and protects what it loves, even at great cost, that refuses to be silenced, that insists on being remembered. And we here, now, in this quiet moment, we can choose to be part of that chain of remembrance.
We can choose to learn these stories, to share them, to support the work of preservation, to insist that African knowledge, African history, African intellectual achievement be given its proper place in the human story. We can refuse to allow the erasure to continue. We can be, in our own small way, guardians of memory.
The night is deep now. Your body is relaxed. Your breathing is slow and even. And in the darkness, the burned libraries of Africa still stand, not as physical structures, but as monuments in human memory. We remember Alexandria. We remember Timbuktu. We remember all the nameless, numberless places where knowledge was created and preserved and lost. We remember the scholars, the scribes, the families who guarded manuscripts, the modern librarians who continue the work. We remember. And in remembering, we ensure that the fire is not final, that the silence is not complete, that the voices, though faint, still speak. Sleep now, if you wish. Let these thoughts drift with you into rest. Let the sadness of loss be balanced by the beauty of what was created. Let the anger at injustice be tempered by the inspiration of those who resisted and preserved. Let the acknowledgement of erasure be joined with the hope of recovery. For the story is not over. The work continues. And as long as there are people who care, who remember, who act to preserve and protect, the light that was kindled in Africa's libraries thousands of years ago will never be entirely extinguished. It may flicker, it may dim, but it endures. In fragments, in memories, in the patient work of reconstruction. It endures. And you are part of that endurance now. By listening, by knowing, by carrying these stories forward, you are a link in the chain, a guardian of memory, a bearer of witness. Rest now in that knowledge. Rest knowing that the burned libraries of Africa have not been forgotten, that their wisdom, though scattered, still echoes, that the human drive to know, to preserve, to pass on, continues, today and tomorrow and for all the days to come. The fire may burn, but the spirit that kindled the first flame, that lit the first lamp, that wrote the first word, that spirit can never be destroyed. It is eternal. It is human. It is you.
Sleep peacefully. Dream of libraries rising from ashes. Dream of manuscripts being carefully unrolled and read. Dream of knowledge being shared freely. Dream of a world where every culture's wisdom is honored, where every voice is heard, where the human story is told complete with all its chapters, all its voices, all its vast and beautiful complexity. Dream of that world, for in dreaming it, we begin to create it. In remembering what was lost, we prepare to recover what can still be found. In honoring the past, we illuminate the future. The burned libraries of Africa stand in memory, and memory, unlike paper, unlike stone, unlike anything physical, cannot be destroyed as long as there are minds to hold it, hearts to care, voices to speak it into being again and again. You are one of those voices now. Rest in that. Rest knowing you are part of something larger than yourself, part of the great human chain of memory and meaning, part of the light. Good night. May you rest peacefully. May you dream beautifully. May you wake remembering that knowledge, once created, can never be entirely destroyed. It changes form, it hides, it waits, but it endures, like the stars that the scholars of Alexandria studied, like the wisdom preserved in the manuscripts of Timbuktu, like the human spirit itself. It endures.